Windows NT. Windows NT is a family of operating systems produced by Microsoft, the first version of which was released on July 27, 1993. It is a processor-independent, multiprocessing, and multi-user operating system. The first version of Windows NT was Windows NT 3.1 and was produced for workstations and server computers. It was intended to complement consumer versions of Windows that were based on MS-DOS, including Windows 1.0 through 1.3.1x. Gradually, the Windows NT family was expanded into Microsoft's general-purpose operating system product line for all personal computers, deprecating the Windows 9X family. NT formerly expanded to New Technology, but no longer carries any specific meaning. Starting with Windows 2000, NT was removed from the product name, and it is only included in the product version string. NT was the first purely 32-bit version of Windows, whereas its consumer-oriented counterparts, Windows 3.1x and Windows 9x, were 16-bit/32-bit hybrids. It is a multi-architecture operating system. Initially, it supported several instruction set architectures, including IA32, MIPS, DEC Alpha. Support for PowerPC, Titanium, x64, and ARM were added later. The latest versions support x86, more specifically IA32 and x64, and ARM. Major features of the Windows NT family include Windows Shell, Windows API, Native API, Active Directory, Group Policy, Hardware Abstraction Layer, NTFS, BitLocker, Windows Store, Windows Update, and Hyper-V. Naming. It has been suggested that Dave Cutler intended the initialism WNT as a play on VMS, incrementing each letter by 1. However, the project was originally intended as a follow-on to OS2 and was referred to as NT OS2 before receiving the Windows brand. One of the original NT developers, Mark Lukowski, states that the name was taken from the original target processor, the Intel i860, codenamed N10, as a 1998 question and answer session with Bill Gates revealed that the letters were previously expanded to New Technology but no longer carry any specific meaning. The letters were dropped from the names of releases from Windows 2000 and later, though Microsoft described that product as being built on NT technology. Major features. A main design goal of NT was hardware and software portability. Various versions of NT family operating systems have been released for a variety of processing architectures, initially IA32, MIPS, and DEC Alpha, with PowerPC, Titanium, x86-64, and ARM supported in later releases. The idea was to have a common code base with a custom hardware abstraction layer, HAL, for each platform. However, support for MIPS, Alpha, and PowerPC were later dropped in Windows 2000. Broad software compatibility was achieved with support for several API personalities, including Windows API, POSIX, and OS2 APIs. The latter two were phased out starting with Windows XP. Partial MS-DOS compatibility was achieved via an integrated DOS virtual machine, although this feature is being phased out in the x86-64 architecture. NT supported per-object, file, function, and role access control lists, allowing a rich set of security permissions to be applied to the systems and services. NT supported Windows network protocols, inheriting the previous OS2 LAN manager networking, as well as TCP/IP networking, for which Microsoft would implement a TCP/IP stack derived at first from a streams-based stack from Spider Systems, then later rewritten in-house. Windows NT 3.1 was the first version of Windows to use 32-bit flat virtual memory addressing on 32-bit processors, and its companion product, Windows 3.1, used segmented addressing in switches from 16-bit to 32-bit addressing in pages. Windows NT 3.1 features a core kernel providing a system API, running in supervisor mode, Ring 0 and x86, referred to in Windows NT as kernel mode on all platforms, and a set of user space environments with their own APIs, which included the new Win32 environment, an OS2 1.3 text mode environment, and a POSIX environment. The full preemptive multitasking kernel could interrupt running tasks to schedule other tasks without relying on user programs to voluntarily give up control of the CPU, as in Windows 3.1 Windows applications, although MS-DOS applications were preemptively multitasked in Windows starting with Windows 386. Notably, in Windows NT 3.x, several I.O. driver subsystems, such as video and printing, were user mode subsystems. In Windows NT 4, the video, server, and printer spooler subsystems were moved into kernel mode. Windows NT's first GUI was strongly influenced by, and programmatically compatible with, that from Windows NT 3.1. Windows NT 4's interface was redesigned to match that of the brand new Windows 95, moving from the Program Manager to the Windows Shell design. NTFS, a journaled security file system, was created for NT. Windows NT also allows for other installable file systems. Starting with version 3.1, NT could be installed on FAT or HPFS file systems. Windows NT introduced its own driver model, the Windows NT driver model, and it is compatible with older driver frameworks. With Windows 2000, the Windows NT driver model was enhanced to become the Windows driver model, which was first introduced with Windows 98, but was based on the NT driver model. Windows Vista added native support for the Windows Driver Foundation, which is also available for Windows XP, Windows Server 2003, and to an extent, Windows 2000. Development. Microsoft had decided to create a portable operating system compatible with OS2 and POSIX and supporting multiprocessing in October 1988. When development started in November 1989, Windows NT was to be known as OS2 3.0, the third version of the operating system developed jointly by Microsoft and IBM. To ensure portability, initial development was targeted at the Intel i86XR RISC processor, switching to the MIPS R3000 in late 1989, and then the Intel i386 in 1990. Microsoft also continued parallel development of the DOS-based and less resource-demanding Windows environment, resulting in the release of Windows 3.0 in May 1990. Windows 3 was eventually so successful that Microsoft decided to change the primary application programming interface for the still unreleased NT OS2, as it was then known, from an extended OS2 API to an extended Windows API. The decision caused tension between Microsoft and IBM, and the collaboration ultimately fell apart. IBM continued OS2 development alone, while Microsoft continued work on the newly renamed Windows NT. Though neither operating system would immediately be as popular as Microsoft's MS-DOS or Windows products, Windows NT would eventually be far more successful than OS2. Microsoft hired a group of developers from Digital Equipment Corporation led by Dave Cutler to build Windows NT, and many elements of the design reflect earlier DEC experience with Cutler's VMS and RSX-11, but also an unreleased object-based operating system developed by Dave Cutler for DEC Prism. The team was jointed by selected members of the disbanded OS2 team, included Mosh Dooney. The operating system was designed to run on multiple instruction set architectures and multiple hardware platforms with each architecture. The platform dependencies are largely hidden from the rest of the system by a kernel mode module called the HAL, Hardware Abstraction Layer. Windows NT's kernel mode code further distinguishes between the kernel, whose primary purpose is to implement processor and architecture-dependent functions, and the executive. This was designed as a modified microkernel, as the Windows NT kernel was influenced by the mock microkernel developed at Carnegie Mellon University, but does not meet all of the criteria of a pure microkernel. Both the kernel and the executive are linked together in a single loaded module, NTOS kernel.exe. From outside this module, there is little distinction between the kernel and the executive. Routines from each are directly accessible, as for example from the kernel mode device drivers. API sets in the Windows NT family are implemented as subsystems atop the publicly documented native API. This allowed the late adoption of the Windows API into the Windows 32 subsystem. Windows NT was one of the earliest operating systems to use Unicode internally. Releases. See also List of Microsoft Windows versions. Windows NT 3.1 to 3.51 incorporated the Program Manager and File Manager from the Windows 3.1x series. Windows NT 4.0 onwards replaced those programs with Windows Explorer, including a taskbar and start menu which originally appeared in Windows 95. The first release was given version number 3.1 to match the contemporary 16-bit Windows. Magazines of that era claimed that the number was also used to make that version seem more reliable than a .0 release. Also, the novel IPX protocol was apparently licensed only to 3.1 versions of Windows software. The NT version number is not now generally used for microsync purposes, but it is still used internally and said to reflect the degree of changes to the core of the operating system. However, for application compatibility reasons, Microsoft kept the major version number as 6 in releases following Vista, but changed it later to 10 in Windows 10. The build number is an internal identifier used by Microsoft developers and beta testers. Programming language. Windows NT is written in C and C++, with a very small amount written in assembly language. C is mostly used for the kernel code, while C++ is mostly used for user mode code. Assembly language is avoided where possible because it would impede portability. Supported platforms. 32-bit platforms. In order to prevent Intel x86 specific code from slipping into the operating system by developers used to developing on x86 chips, Windows NT 3.1 was initially developed using non-x86 development systems and then ported to the x86 architecture. This work was initially based on the Intel i860-based Dazzle system and, later, the MIPS R4000-based Jazz platform. Both systems were designed internally at Microsoft. Windows NT 3.1 was released for Intel x86 PC-compatible, PC98, DEC Alpha, and ARC-compliant MIPS platforms. Windows NT 3.51 added support for the PowerPC processor in 1995, specifically PrEP. Compliant systems such as the IBM Power Series desktops/laptops and the Motorola PowerStack series. But despite meetings between Michael Spindler and Bill Gates, not on the Power Macintosh and the PrEP-compliant Power Macintosh project failed to ship. Intergraph Corporation ported Windows NT to its Clipper architecture and later announced intention to port Windows NT 3.51 to Sun Microsystems' SPARC architecture, but neither version was sold to the public as a retail product. Only two of the Windows NT 4.0 variants, IA32 and Alpha, have a full set of service packs available. All of the other ports done by third parties, Motorola, Intergraph, etc., have few, if any, publicly available updates. Windows NT 4.0 was the last major release to support Alpha, MIPS, or PowerPC, though development of Windows 2000 for Alpha continued until August 1999, when Compaq stopped supported for Windows NT on that architecture. And then 3 days later, Microsoft also canceled their Alpha NT program, even though the Alpha NT5 Windows 2000 release had reached RC1 status. Microsoft announced on January 5, 2011, that the next major version of the Windows NT family will include support for the ARM architecture. Microsoft demonstrated a preliminary version of Windows, version 6.2.7867, running on an ARM-based computer at the 2011 Consumer Electronics Show. This eventually led to the commercial release of Windows 8-derived Windows RT on October 26, 2012, and the implementation of Windows NT over CE on Windows Phone 8. According to Microsoft, it is a common misconception that the Xbox and Xbox 360 use a modified Windows 2000 kernel, for the Xbox operating system was built from scratch, but implements a subset of Windows APIs. 64-bit platforms. The 64-bit versions of Windows NT were originally intended to run on Titanium DEC Alpha. The latter was used internally at Microsoft during an early development of 64-bit Windows. This continued for some time after Microsoft publicly announced that it was canceling plans to ship 64-bit Windows for Alpha. Because of this, Alpha versions of Windows NT are 32-bit only. While Windows 2000 only supports Intel IA32, 32-bit, Windows XP, Server 2003, Server 2008, and Server 2008 R2 each have one edition dedicated to Itanium-based systems. In comparison with the Itanium, Microsoft adopted x64 on a greater scale. Every version of Windows since Windows XP, which had a dedicated x64 edition, has x64 editions. Hardware requirements. The minimum hardware specification required to run each release of the professional workstation version of Windows NT has been fairly slow moving until the 6.0 Vista release, which requires a minimum of 15 gigabytes of free space, a 10-fold increase in free disk space alone over the previous version. See also Architecture of Windows NT, F6 disk, Windows Server domain, React OS, an open source project with the goal of providing binary and device driver level compatibility with Windows NT, Windows NT startup process, Windows pre-installation environment, and Microsoft servers.